everybody, and welcome back to Workflows and Espressos. I am sitting in my living room slash kitchen. It's basically all one room, and it is, let's see, uh, 20 degrees in Jackson right now. It's a balmy 20 degrees. And as I sit here in my kitchen and I reflect on DARM, last week, I had the opportunity to speak on a session about forecasting, and the title was Fun with Forecasting. And my goal was to it was an advanced session. So I was focusing less on teaching people why forecasting was so important, assuming that if you're in an advanced revenue management session, you know why it's important, and more how you can have the best forecast for your business and make sure that you are as successful as possible with the forecasts that you do create. So I planned for this session for a long time and was really nervous about it. And I basically broke forecasting down into four methods and how each method is important and how they stand alone, but how combined they set you up for the best strategy. And I really wanted to redo this conversation on the podcast for a couple of reasons. One, I know there are listeners of the podcast that didn't go to DARM or that didn't sit in on the session that I feel like could take away from the session. And two, it's such a timely part of the year. We are about to head into 2025, where we are going to need to make sure that we have accurate forecasts. Things are getting harder and harder to plan for because our industry is becoming more and more unpredictable in terms of demand. And so I thought as we were all planning our forecast for 2025, it would be great to send you out some tips and tricks. And also is really interesting because when I think about my passions in the industry, like revenue management would definitely be one of them. Do I want to be a revenue manager in my day-to-day career? No. Like that isn't what my calling feels like it is anymore. But it is one of the things that I feel super passionately about within our industry. Like I love the operation side and maybe I just love everything, honestly, because I think I was about to list out every single department. But it is where I started in the industry. And I think it's evolved so much that I've kept really, really engaged with revenue management because it's changed a lot since 2015 when I first started with 360 Blue. And it's always fun to keep up with the new technologies and new processes and talk to revenue managers who are actively managing revenue right now about what they're doing and how they're facing uncertainty. So I thought that I would go back to my roots a little bit, and this episode is dedicated to revenue management. So it's going to be pretty data heavy. I, of course, try to keep things as interesting as possible. But if you are not the data person on your team, you might find this a little boring. So send it to the data person on your team. And without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so this is really funny. When I started the session, I said to everyone in the room, like, the pressure of keeping people awake for 35 minutes when you're talking about forecasting is high, but why would you listen to me? Like, what makes me qualified to teach you about forecasting? And I joked in the session that Jason Sprinkle was my revenue management mentor and that I was the self-proclaimed first key data employee. And both of those things are sort of true, but also sort of not true. So Jason at 360 was such an incredible mentor on the revenue management side. Our CEO, Ashley, was just like phenomenal. And I worked really, really closely with Tyler Ware, who I've had on the podcast, who was our director of marketing. And really, it took the owner, the CEO, the director of revenue, and the director of marketing, and honestly, our director of guest services as well, to really hone in on a strategy. And I think that that is what has made me able to speak on like a holistic picture of revenue management, because you can't do it without the marketing and the guest services side. And when I first started, I was managing revenue for about 225 homes all along 30A, and then mainly like Old 98 and Destin, and we expanded throughout the years and ended up spanning all the way from like Holiday Island, Destin to Panama City, which I know 360 spans even farther now. And we had about 700 homes when I transitioned out of the company. So it was a large portfolio. We had a whole team. We had a revenue management coordinator whose job was mainly data entry. We were using data tools. Of course, key data really started in the 360 offices. So we were the main cheerleaders of key data back then and doing whatever we could to advance the product to make it easier for revenue managers all over the country and then the world to manage revenue. So I do have some experience. I will say I have not been a full-time revenue manager in about 3 years. So, maybe longer than that, maybe 4 years. So it's been a while, but I've been keeping up. And I want to dive into the core 4 methods. So, this is historical based forecasting, number 1, demand based forecasting, number 2, competitive set benchmarking, number 3, and then event driven seasonality, number 4. And really putting that all together. So, it's said in every single revenue management session that there isn't this one size fits all method. And while I do believe that to be true, I really wanted to focus these sessions on 4 methods that I do think, when combined, builds a pretty bulletproof plan for the future. And this like layered approach is what I call like a hybrid approach. So we'll get into that later on. But I know Key Data sent out a recent industry survey to about 200 respondents, or they got about 200 respondents. And the top strategies that revenue managers plan to employ in 2025 were pricing optimization and pricing competitively, inventory growth, and owner retention. So I was really surprised, like the strategies that landed on the bottom were acquiring market competitors, which does make sense, increasing rates, which it's wild that that fell from the very top of the list in the last couple of years to now the very bottom of the list, and then adapting new tools and dynamic pricing, which was also interesting. I mean, I think that people already have their tools in place, but it just kind of goes to show that we're not spending money on new tools, we're optimizing what we have. And then additionally, in another part of the survey, property managers said that they expected a modest level of growth in both revenue and occupancy over the next 12 months. So I thought that that was interesting, right? Like, you talk to people in 2021, 2022, we were expecting this massive growth. And then last year we were like, hey, we're just lucky to hold on. We're going to get rates as low as they can and hope that we win this occupancy game. But I want to make sure that we're structuring our forecast to ensure that we are maximizing growth, because I do think it's going to be possible in 2025 to see some growth. So let's go in to historical data. So I asked the people in the room how many of them were building their forecast off of historical data alone. And I would say there was probably 60, 70 people in the room. And about 5 people raised their hand. What if I'm like totally misremembering this, because I was like anxious because I was speaking? There were like 30 people there. I swear it felt like more. So I was happy to see that. There were pretty few people that were, I mean, I will say, when you ask people to raise their hand in an advanced revenue management session, like, the pressure is kind of on. But historical data forecasting, or building your forecast off of historical data, is the most well known method in our industry because it's been around the longest. But now we have the technology at our fingertips to really make it more complex. So, what I mean by historical data forecasting, this is analyzing your past performance to predict your future trends. So, typically, you're referencing the past like 1 to 3 years of data, and you're really looking at the main metrics of occupancy, ADR, and RevPAR, the big 3, and then your booking window as well. So, here's when it's going to work for you: when you have a portfolio with really consistent past performance. And I think that's been hard. Like, of course, we need to remove anomalies like COVID. But if you have a typical like seasonality trend and you have about the same occupancy during the seasonality, of course, like every market has their main seasonality. But if you're noticing the same levels of occupancy year over year, And there's just this really predictable performance and demand and minimal disruption. You don't see a lot of growth, you don't see a lot of attrition. This method, you can put more weight into it, right? Because the four methods we're going to talk about, they're all important. It's just how much weight you want to put into each one. So, historical data forecasting can fall apart in a couple of ways, right? So, it relies on the assumption that the future is going to resemble the past, which is, you know, over the last couple of years, I think it's brave for us to assume that the future is always going to resemble the past. You never know what's going to happen. And it fails in scenarios when you have market disruptions like pandemics that we're talking about, any new competitors that enter the market that you aren't accounting for, and then any evolving guest behaviors, which guest behaviors have evolved quite a bit over the last couple of years. And it also ignores external influences. So, macroeconomic trends and changing travel patterns, and then any changes in your portfolio, historical data is not going to pick up on as well, right? Like this is static data. So, you're not going to see any gained properties or growth that you're expecting for the next year. And then, of course, attrition. So, those all have to be built into your forecast. So, best practices when you are building out a historical or a forecast based largely on historical data, or that you're adding in historical data to your forecast. So, you want to make sure your data is super clean always, right? No matter when, but especially now when you're looking at it. So, removing any anomalies. So, if you had a one off season or a one off year, and that shouldn't really be built into your last like 1 to 3 years of historical data. If you've had a lot of owner usage at a particular property that you know isn't going to happen in the future, or you have a lot of maintenance holds at particular properties that aren't going to happen in the future, you brought one home on in the middle of the year and it took them a while to get onboarded, so you didn't really see a full year of revenue. You want to make sure that you're accounting for all of that. And then also attrition and growth. So, I encourage everybody to have their attrition percentage year over year. So you lose a portion of your revenue or your properties every single year. And in ski destinations, I found that the attrition percentage is significantly lower than they are in beach markets. So beach markets, your attrition percentage could be as high as 15% year over year, but you also could have a growth rate of 25%. So your net gain is still there. But understanding what your average attrition and growth rate looks like, you're going to want to build that into your forecast so you can account for the revenue that you're going to lose with homes you're going to offboard, and then revenue that you're going to gain based on homes you're onboarding this next year that you expect to onboard. And always make sure that you're prorating that revenue as it comes off, right? Some homeowners are going to come off in the middle of the year, so you're still going to get half a year of revenue. And then homes are going to come on 3/4 of the way into the year, and you're only going to get a quarter of that revenue. So, accounting for those anomalies and just adjustments in the timing that you're expecting for these homes, and then watching out for those new competitors. So, of course, in those super dense markets, you have new competitors popping up all the time. 30A is a really great example. Feels like there's new business opening up their doors every single week. So, accounting for those. Of course, you're not always worried about those new guys down the street that they're going to kind of come in and take your business. But there are markets where a new competitor could be evolving and growing rapidly and taking business from you. So, making sure that you're accounting for that in your forecast. And then any seasonal shifts. So, Easter and Thanksgiving, these holidays that aren't on the same day every single year. And so, any holidays that are shifting days year over year, and then regulatory changes. So, if you are facing regulation right now that you know is going to impact you in the future year, unfortunately, making sure that you're accounting for that in your historical data. So, demand based forecasting is the second method that I really went into. So, this is using real time data. So, website searches, inquiries, booking windows to make revenue decisions. And typically, this is way more of a short, like real time, like I said, data versus long term strategy. So, you can really think of historical data as setting your long term strategy. And demand based is going to come in, and this is how you're going to use data to change things in the short term and make decisions in the short term. So, this really typically works with urban markets or markets that have a lot of fluctuating demand. And then when you have a team that can really pivot and act super quickly. So when you have this real time data coming at you all the time, you need to make inferences from it and also adjustments. And so you need to make sure that you've got a team in place that can make these adjustments quickly and on the fly, and that you're taking advantage of this real time data. So, this really just goes beyond the static data, right? Real time data is so great because it's real, it's coming in, you understand what your inquiries have looked like. So we use Demand IQ at Outpost and it's built into key data. So it shows us what our inquiries are looking like, the arrival date people are searching for, the length of stay that people are searching for, how many homes we have available for every search query that guests are running. But demand-based data does require tools such as key data that can aggregate this like top of funnel data meaningfully. So think Wheelhouse and Price Labs as well that also have this demand-based data. What I like about demand-based data coming from your website, so Demand IQ that's in key data, is that it's pulling real data directly from your website searches so you know that you can trust it. And aggregated or scraped data is a little bit harder to trust. So here's when it's going to fall apart for you. So gaps or inaccuracies in your data sources, of course, and high volatility markets. So any markets that have really rapid changes in demand, any rapid changes in weather, last minute events. So let's talk Miami, for example, right? Like demand based forecasting is great because Miami has a lot of events, but Miami also is in the middle of hurricane season for half the year. And that is also just a high volatility situation where guests don't have as much trust and they're relying on those cancellation policies. So just being mindful of that as you're building out this forecast with this demand data. And it can also be really myopic. So just meaning you're looking really only into the near future. So it's difficult to build this like meaningful long-term strategy, which we talked about. So let's get into best practices. Monitoring booking pace compared to historical data is huge. So you always want to make sure that you've got historical data pulled up at any given time. Like that to me is such a baseline for any forecast. And then monitoring that booking pace against your historical data so you know when there's a problem. Top of funnel indicators are going to be huge here. So, for example, a spike in keyword searches, right, indicates like a good surge in demand. Although we have to make sure that we're monitoring conversions because even if you have a spike in searches, inquiries are really high. If you're not getting any conversions, that's typically a sign that your rates are not where they need to be. And then you want to also make sure that you're segmenting your properties by booking window. So, for example, a property that's 7 bedrooms is $50,000 a week to rent is going to book very differently than a home that is a condo that sleeps 4. And I think like this is something that I'm super passionate about rather than grouping homes by bedroom or by price. We group our homes and set our strategies based on the booking windows. And obviously, that relies a lot on historical data and their past booking windows. And of course, we're making sure that we're removing any anomalies in the data. But I do think it's really great. Like, it's something that you can adjust. Like, if a home moves from one booking window to another over the course of a year, that's totally fine. It's easy to change your custom seasonal profile and whatever pricing tool you're using. But I think it's great. And of course, like, if you manage mostly condos, and that have very similar booking windows, or if your inventory is very similar, then this will apply a little less to you. But if you do have inventory that's kind of spanning, you have those larger, more expensive homes to those smaller condos, it could be really great for you to segment by booking window. I'd like to get into competitive set benchmarking now. Such an unusual episode because I really got down to business. Okay, so competitive set benchmarking, we know what this means, right? We're comparing KPIs with similar properties in our market. And competitor data is scraped data. So let's talk about that just from the very beginning. So you're using aggregated or scraped data from with either like key data or wheelhouse or price labs or AirDNA, whatever tool you're using that's telling you what your competitors ADR, occupancy, and RevPAR looks like, right? We need to understand that with this scraped data, there is a level of disbelief that we have to have in it, right? And we can't suspend all disbelief, I guess is what I should say. And we'll get into that. But Competitive set benchmarking really works when you're in a super highly competitive market. So if you have a lot of competitors, you feel like you're going against these like vacation rental companies in your market or even hosts for that matter, or these rental by owners to confused. I wonder if RBO is even a term that's used anymore. Is that only called a host? I should know this, but this is actually really interesting because over the last, I don't know, 10 years have always referred to like hosts as RBOs or rental by owners, but I guess that's like an antiquated term now and they're hosts. So, competitive set benchmarking is very similar. You need to have a team that can parse out this data and read between the lines. So, I always say when you're looking at competitor data, focus more on the trend lines than the exact figures. That's just a level of understanding that you need to have with scraped data. Is this trust is It's a very different level than when you're looking at real data, and most of you already know that by now. So just parsing it out and making sure that you're focusing on the trend rather than these like exact figures and making decisions based on this is going to be more helpful and allow you to build a more accurate forecast that's more meaningful to you and your unique properties. Competitor set data, like where does it fall apart? We already talked about this like aggregated data, right? But assuming competitor accuracy is a really big one, right? Like your competitors might not always be right. Who says that they're pricing the best in the entire market and that you need to be pricing based on what your competitors are doing? And this scraped data that we're talking about, it doesn't include owner nights. It doesn't include maintenance holes or owners who set their own pricing, right? There are so many limitations within this like data field. I think it is having access to scraped data is huge. And when we got that as an industry, like it really leveled things up for us. And don't think that I think it's horrible because we use it literally every single day and build it into our forecast 1,000%. It's just this level of, trust that you need to understand, like, the level of trust you should have it in, I should say. And then competitor set data really fails to consider that, like, unique value, and I'm not talking about an owner unique value who thinks their home is, like, the most amazing, incredible home of all time. I'm talking about the actual unique value in this property compared to the person next door. And then, like, blindly copying competitors, I think, of course, it falls apart in that, instance, which I know that that's really hard when you have owners pressuring you to do that, but making sure that you have the right data and the right ability within your team to have those educated conversations with owners is where you're gonna win in those circumstances. I typically like to build a competitor set. Like if you're looking at one property to trying to figure out how many homes you should be comparing one property to, I like to say like 10 to 15. I think when you start comparing one home to hundreds, which, hey, this is very dependent on like if you're in a condo complex, that is very different, right? Of course, then in that instance, you can compare it to more. But I'm talking like an individual home in a subdivision. I think if you get more than like 10 to 15 homes, that data gets pretty muddy. So, best practices with this competitive set benchmarking data. You're going to want to focus on properties with similar attributes, of course. So, size, amenities, location, all the things. And then that similar like look and feel of decor as well. And then segmenting your properties and creating custom comp sets based on the segmentation that you have created. Do not let the tool segment for you. I think this is a really great time to get that human intervention involved. Avoiding including irrelevant properties in that data set that could skew data. So, any properties that the owner sets their own rates or they're just an anomaly in some way or another, making sure that you're removing that. Using multiple data sources, I think this is so important to cross validate insights. So, not just a key data and not just a wheelhouse, but using them together, I think is huge. Or not just a key data and a price lapse, but using them together. And then sticking to the trend line and not the exact figure, which we already went into. And the key metrics here, I think, are the big three: the occupancy, ADR, and RevPAR metrics, which, it's always the big three. What can I say? All right. Let's get into our last one. You guys are like, hey, we've been listening to you talk for quite a long time about some boring data. Event driven seasonality. So, this is going to be focusing on predicting demand spikes and dips based on key events that are happening in your area and seasonal patterns that are in your area. So, think urban markets that are really heavily event dependent, and then also leisure destinations with really high demand surrounding specific holidays. So, Christmas, Thanksgiving. Let's consider spring break a holiday at this point. Okay. So event-driven seasonality, it's newer, right? It is probably the method that I would put the least amount of weight in. Like, of course, I think it's really, really important around those like specific events, particularly in the urban markets. But I think that this is just kind of a cherry on top to your strategy. So it can fall apart in a couple of situations, just like any forecasting method. So uncertainty around events. So think like cancellations, weather disruptions, a change in schedule, and anytime you have an over reliance on an event where you're really relying on this event to produce revenue for you, so you start to price too aggressively, I think is where you can get into trouble. And then when you have shorter booking windows that create that owner panic. So if there's a lot of volatility or an event gets rescheduled or an event isn't scheduled until last minute, that like reliance on these events to have high performance can create owner panic, right? They're like, hey, my calendar is empty. I need answers. And then, of course, that leads you to pricing a little bit too aggressively in a downward way. And that could lead to churn. And it's also really difficult to forecast. So, when you're thinking about event driven seasonality, I want you to think first about building an event calendar. Know what you're looking at. So, include any known events and the impact on demand those events have, and build that into your calendar that everybody on the team has access to. And then analyze the historical impact that these events have had. Go into your operations team, like talk about how you could have done things better for events in the previous years that have been really busy on your operations team. Talk to the team on the phones or that are answering guest emails about the spike in overall like inquiries that you've had and how you can get to those faster. Like planning around these events on your entire company's operations, I think is huge. And in this event calendar, we want to make sure that we're analyzing these compression periods. So, for example, like determining when demand begins to spike and drop for specific events. And then, of course, always, and I know that this sucks, but as revenue managers, we have to do it. We have to move quickly and make these dynamic rate adjustments. And I really love setting tiered event pricing if needed. So, for example, during Christmas, if I have, like, let's say, I segment my properties by booking window. So I'm looking at my booking window between 35 and 51 days. I typically like to have like pretty short spans of booking windows so I can have more custom pricing groups. And that just allows for better overall like forecasting and higher RevPAR because the more that you're segmenting your properties, obviously the more like individual attention each home is getting, which I believe in anyway, by the way. Back to this like tiered event price. So for this like 35 to 51 day booking window group, if I'm looking specifically at Christmas, let's say I'll set my minimum at X, my maximum at X. If it books within this time frame, the rate's going to be 10% higher. If it books within this time frame, it's going to be 5% higher. I feel like that's complicated to explain over a podcast. So I do have some graphs and like charts of tiered pricing strategies that I've done. So if anyone is interested and you're not asleep because you've been listening to this for 30 minutes, then please email me or reach out to me on LinkedIn and I can share it with you. Let's talk about the hybrid approach, the layered approach, my personal favorite. So I'm talking through how we can add all four of these methods together to create this like layered best practice. So, I think the first step is setting up weekly discussions with revenue marketing and the reservations team. And I've gone into detail on this podcast about the agenda that I think is really important for these revenue meetings. Again, like reach out to me on LinkedIn if you want a copy of this agenda. But I think these weekly discussions make such a meaningful impact. And then I said this in the beginning of the conversation, but using historical data as your baseline for long term forecasting and then adjusting for real time trends over time. So, like, let's say your annual forecast is built off of historical data, and then you are building in real time demand spikes and dips to fluctuate rates. And you're adding in event driven seasonality, and you're looking at your competitors and making those real time adjustments, right? Like, it is historical data is always going to be your baseline. And then the other three approaches are going to be what's like shorter term, real time fluctuations. And then, of course, iterating and refining over time. So, Megan's tips my top 4 tips, which you guys have all heard because you're listeners of the podcast, I hope, or at least you're listening to this episode. So the first tip is individualizing your properties and taking a look at them. I think this is really hard when your inventory starts to get bigger, and this is when you need like larger revenue management teams. But it makes such a difference reviewing each property individually and setting a goal for them for the year. I think projections, annual projections are so important, and that is what you can build into your budget. The 80/20 rule, which if you've literally ever had one conversation with me, I've talked about it. 80% of your revenue comes from the top 20% of your homes. So making sure that you are really coddling those properties and putting a lot of time and attention on owner communication, and of course, your rates and revenue and care of the home to make sure that you're retaining those is so, so, so important. Forward looking pacing reports. We talked about this earlier in this conversation. Huge. Pull these daily and make adjustments daily based on what your pacing reports are looking like. And then I think now more than ever, if you haven't already, looking at your booking rules that you have in place and evaluating those, I think is incredibly important. So think length of stay, any rules that you have on your specific channels, minimum pricing, maximum pricing, booking rules. They are changing rapidly. If you still have a 7-day restriction during the summer, it can be really hard to uphold that. Like things have changed significantly over the past 5 years. So, evaluating those booking rules all the time and then being super transparent with those homeowners, I think is really important. I also love the funnel method, huge fan of the funnel method. So, think starting really high level and looking at your portfolio as a whole across the entire year, and then noticing what date you might have a little bit of a dip in occupancy or RevPAR year over year, and then honing in on that date range. Okay, now we're looking at spring break the week of March 17th. Okay, well, what neighborhoods are performing poorly, or what segments of property? Is it 5 bedrooms that are performing improperly, I should say? And using that funnel method to kind of hone in on where your exact problems are. I think starting big and going small is so important. And then, as always, I said this actually last week, everything should be written in the sand, right? If you know me, if we've learned one thing over time, our industry is ever evolving like crazy, and our processes need to be doing the same. So make sure that you're communicating with your owners, that you're utilizing your network, and the best approach is always the one that works for you. So I hope you got something from this episode today. Make sure that you are attending DARM if you're a revenue manager. It's such a great conference. And if you didn't go this year, there's always next year. It is if you're a revenue manager, or if you're a data analyst, or if you're in marketing or reservations or guest services. It's such a good conference to go to and talk data with other nerds for a couple of days. I'm excited to see you all at the next show, which at this point, I guess will be the executive summit. And I'll see you then. Okay. Subscribe. See you next week. Bye.